In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created. Let us pray. O God, who didst instruct the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant us in the same Spirit to be truly wise, and ever to rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Awesome. Today, we are going to be talking about Irenaeus and Leon. This is our last class. For part one of the history of the early church, the Apostolic Fathers. And Saint Irenaeus of Lyon is not technically an Apostolic Father because he came after the Apostolic Fathers, but he's very important for them because he sort of sums up the story of the Apostolic Fathers, and he was taught by Polycarp of Smyrna, one of the Apostolic Fathers. And I passed out some excerpts of Saint Irenaeus' work. And Saint Irenaeus lived from about 130 to 200. He was raised in Asia Minor, probably in Smyrna. He writes that he was taught as a young man, by Polycarp of Smyrna, who by then was an old man. And he later moved to France. The city of Lyon in the southern part of France is an ancient city and had an established Christian community. And ultimately, one of its bishops was martyred, and Irenaeus got elected Bishop of Lyon, where he ended his life about the year 200. Irenaeus, and we'll study Irenaeus, God willing, in the fall, when we talk about his work against the various heresies. He wrote a book, several books, and one was against the heresies, which was to refute the various Gnostic heresies which had arisen in Rome and throughout the Mediterranean world. It's an odd thing, as the church grew and spread, there were many sects and prophets and preachers all appeared and started teaching all kinds of strange things. The churches, they didn't have real church buildings because the religion was, Christian religion was not a legal religion, but the people would meet in houses, and they would meet in various houses, and depending upon what charismatic leader you had, you might go to this house and that house and the other house. And so if you were a family, a Greek-speaking family, and you moved to Rome, in the 100s up to the year 200 and actually beyond, and you went around looking for a church, you'd find a whole lot of people teaching a whole lot of different things. And Irenaeus is the first Catholic theologian. And in his writings, what he writes about is how you discern what the real Church of Jesus Christ is, and how you tell from all these various prophets and teachers what the true teaching is. A particular heresy, and we'll study this in the fall, God willing, a particular heresy that arose was called Gnosticism. There are lots of varieties of Gnosticism. Gnostics comes from the word gnosis. This Greek word means knowledge. And what these people would say is there's this secret knowledge. They have a little church together and they say, there's this secret knowledge that Jesus imparted to the very elect people. It's not for everybody. And if you join our church and go up through the levels, you can get more and more of the secret. And we'll invite Felix to you. And as you get into it, it's all kinds of very strange things, very strange doctrines. And that was very, very prevalent in Rome. Rome was very susceptible to all these Oriental religions and sort of weird cults. And the Gnostics were teaching that if you join Christianity, involved getting this secret wisdom and secret knowledge, and as you progressed up the ladder, you became among the perfect, and the perfect were the people who were really going to go to heaven and all. And so you had to work on your knowledge. Irenaeus wrote his book, a lot of books against this, and then against the heretics. He says that that's not the true teaching, and he appealed not really to theology or a philosophy to refute that. He said the way you tell the true teaching is you go and find out who sent the teachers, and basically he writes about the necessity of the apostolic succession. He says if you go to Rome and go to a church, you need to find a church founded by Jesus Christ, imparted to his apostles, and handed on by their true successors. And that's the way you find the true teaching of the church, and that's the true church. And so he's a very important writer at establishing the apostolic succession. With that, I'd like to read a little bit out of this. I've got a 2-pager front and back, which are excerpts from Irenaeus. Let's start on the back page, Fragments from the Lost Writings of Irenaeus. And I mentioned this last week when we talked about Polycarp, but it's important to know who Irenaeus is. The last part is Fragments from the Lost Writings of Irenaeus. In part 2, he's writing a letter to a man named Florinus. This excerpt here was published by Eusebius in his history. It's an excerpt from the Lost Writings of Irenaeus. But Irenaeus is writing to Florinus, and Florinus has fallen in with these heretics and has these bad opinions. So Irenaeus is writing to Florinus, and he says, "These opinions, Florinus, that I may speak in mild terms, are not a sound doctrine. These opinions are not consonant to the church, and involve their votaries in the utmost impiety. These opinions, even the heretics beyond the church's pale have never ventured to broach. These opinions, these presbyters who preceded us, and who were conversant with the apostles, did not hand down to thee. For while I was yet a boy, I saw thee, Florinus, in Lower Asia with Polycarp, distinguishing thyself in the royal court, and endeavoring to gain his approbation. For I have a more vivid recollection of what occurred at that time than of recent events, inasmuch as the experiences of childhood, keeping pace with the growth of the soul, become incorporated with it. So that I can even describe the place where the blessed Polycarp used to sit and discourse. His going out to and his coming in, his general mode of life and personal appearance, together with the discourses which he delivered to the people. Also how he would speak of his familiar intercourse, that's conversation, his familiar conversation with John and the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how he would call their words to remembrance. Whatsoever things he had heard from them respecting the Lord, both with regard to his miracles and his teachings, Polycarp, having thus received information from the eyewitnesses of the word of life, would recount them all in harmony with the Scriptures. These things of God's mercy which was upon me, I then listened to attentively, and treasured them up, not on paper, but in my heart. And I am continually, by God's grace, revolving those things accurately in my mind. And I can bear witness before God that if that blessed and apostolical presbyter had heard any such thing as the teachings that Florinus has fallen into, he would have cried out and stopped his ears, exclaiming as he was wont to do, O good God, for what times hast thou preserved me that I should endure such things? And he would have fled from the very spot where, sitting or standing, he had heard such words. This fact, too, can be made clear from his epistles, which he dispatched, whether to neighboring churches to confirm them or to certain of his brethren. And we read the epistle of Polycarp. In any event, Irenaeus here is confirming that he learned his doctrine from Polycarp, who learned it from the Apostle John and others who had seen our Lord Jesus Christ, and that therefore his teaching that he received passed on from Jesus Christ to John and the other people, the other disciples of the Lord, was a true teaching, and what Florinus was falling into was not the true teaching. Let's go over to the first page, the front page of this. This is an excerpt from his book against the Adversus Heresies, against the heresies. And it's a very, very important early church historical document. We have this document. It's scholars admit that it's a genuine early church document. And he's writing against these heretics, and particularly the Gnostics who say that they're hidden mysteries that have to be learned. And he says, let's take some time to go through this. He says, it is within the power of all, therefore, in every church who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles. Tradition means things handed on. The tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. And we are in a position to reckon up those who were by the apostles instituted bishops in the churches, and to demonstrate the succession of these men to our own times. He's talking about the succession of bishops in various towns. First were instituted by the apostles, and then they instituted their successors, laid hands upon them, and there's a line of succession. He says, those who neither taught nor knew of anything like what these heretics rave about, for if the apostles had known hidden mysteries, which they were in the habit of imparting to, quote, the perfect, apart and privily from the rest, they would have delivered them especially to those to whom they were also committing the churches themselves. In other words, if the apostles had this gnosis, this secret knowledge, they would surely have given it to the bishops, who were the successors. And he's saying, for they, the apostles, were desirous that these men, the bishops, should be very perfect and blameless in all things, whom also they were leaving behind as their successors, delivering up their own place of government to these men, which men, if they discharged their functions honestly, would be a great boon to the church, but if they should fall away, the direst calamity. And so he's talking about the apostolic succession of bishops all over the world. That's the true church. And so if you count up who the successors of the apostles in the various towns, Smyrna, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, all these various places, you could find the true church of Christ. Yes?
Yeah, I can understand when they would say that in a way, because it says in the Bible several times, and he taught them in secret, and then it says, it is given to you to understand these mysteries, but not for them. So it's like... Well,
yes, that's true. And we'll get into that in the fall, a little bit more about Gnostics and heresies. But the Gnostics were talking about things that weren't transmitted to the apostles themselves. Christ is saying that there's things I'm telling you and you're going to find out, and particularly after the resurrection, you're going to find out that I'm going to commission you to teach everybody. But there are a lot of people who are not going to understand it. That's what Christ is talking about in those passages, I believe. We'll talk about that in the fall, though. But Irenaeus is talking about the succession of bishops in towns all over the world. And he says, in section 2, since, however, it would be very tedious in a volume such as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, that is, the list of bishops in every church, very, very tedious to do that, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing, by vainglory, or by blindness or perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. Unauthorized meetings are these house churches where the Gnostics and other heretics are having the meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul. What he's saying here is you could try to reckon up the succession of bishops in all the towns, but you don't need to. All you need to do is focus on the principal church founded by the apostles Peter and Paul and reckon up that succession, and you can find the true doctrine. It exists in the other churches as well that have the succession of the bishops, but it would be tedious to try to trace all that, so you can go to Rome. And the reason you can look at the Roman church, he says, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops, for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, the Roman church, on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those who are everywhere. And they have the Latin of this. This is a very crucial early church document. It's preserved in Latin. It talks about the Roman church on account of its preeminent authority. The apostolic succession there basically is the guarantee that what you're getting is the doctrine, the true teaching handed on by God to the apostles in succession. And then he goes and lists the apostolic succession in Rome. Section 3, he says, the blessed apostles, Peter and Paul, then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus, the episcopate. Episcopate means the office of bishop. Episcopus means overseer. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in his epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, sometimes referred to as Cletus. And after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was appointed the bishop, was allotted the bishopric. That's Clement of Rome, who wrote the epistle that we have read. This man, Clement, as he had seen the blessed apostles and had been conversant with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears and their traditions before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for there were many still remaining who had received instruction from the apostles. In the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians, exhorting them to peace, renewing their faith, and declaring the tradition which it had lately received from the apostles, proclaiming the various things you can read here. And you can read those at your leisure, but the point here is that he's talking about Clement and Clement's epistle to the Corinthians. which even at the time of Irenaeus, who's writing in the 180s, this work is being written. The letter of Clement is still honored in the church, east and west, as an authentic teaching of the Church of Rome. Down at the bottom, and he goes through each of the other succeeding popes, he names them, and he comes all the way down to Eleutherius, who does now in the 12th place of the apostles hold the inheritance. In other words, he says, at the time I'm writing this, the Bishop of Rome is Eleutherius, who holds the 12th place from the apostles. He says, in this order, and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth, which is delivered by Jesus Christ, have come down to us. And this is most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. That is the true teaching, and the teaching of these other heretics and Gnostics who do not have this succession, there are not bishops handed down in succession. They do not have the true teaching, and this is how you can determine it. And it's a very, very powerful early historical document. On the next page, I'll let you read this at your leisure. He talks more about Polycarp and about how he got the truth from Polycarp, who got it from John and other people who had seen the Lord. In other words, directly from the source of the church and of its teaching. So we can see how important Irenaeus is to this, and how he links up with two other apostolic fathers, Polycarp and Clement. There is something I need to mention, though, because this is a history class, and as I've said, the Catholic Church has nothing to fear from history. We need to take it as it comes and deal with it, and we should not be frightened about it. There is a difficulty. And if you read into this, and if you read any of the books about the history of the papacy, you will encounter this difficulty. And I say a difficulty in the sense of John Henry Newman, who says, difficulties are things that you can explain and deal. They do not create a doubt. The difficulty is this. The Epistle of Clement, if you recall, was written. The general consensus is it was written AD 96. And the Epistle of Clement has a very peculiar silence. It's headed from the Church of the Romans to the Church of the Corinthians, the Church of Corinth. And it doesn't mention Clement's name. It doesn't say, I'm the Bishop of Rome. I'm the Pope. It has no mention of that. And doesn't mention a bishop in Corinth at all. What has happened in Corinth, according to the letter, is certain presbyters who are in charge of the church there have been ejected from the church. And he's writing and arguing that they need to be brought back into the church, and this is a disorder that needs to be restored. But there's no mention of bishop in Corinth or in Rome, which is very odd, particularly given that it's AD 96. Now, to be sure, the letter does invoke the authority of the Roman Church. If you recall, he talks about the words spoken by him through us, the Church of Rome, and the things written by us through the Holy Spirit. In other words, he's claiming this authority for the Church of Rome in writing to this distant church and telling them what they need to do as a matter of discipline and teaching. But if it's written in AD 96, it's very strange, particularly when you contrast it with Saint Ignatius, who was written maybe about 10, 15 years later in the East. And of course, in Saint Ignatius, if you recall, he's very, very insistent upon the apostolic succession and the order of bishop, presbyters, which are priests, and deacons. And Ignatius says things like, without the bishop, there's not even the name of a church. And that the real Eucharist is wherever the bishop is, and his presbyters, his priests gathered around him. That's where you get a true Eucharist. And he even talks about wherever the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church. So by 110 or so, in the East at least, it's very clear that you have bishops, you have what's called, what scholars call, and this is a fancy word, the monarchical episcopate. Episcopate is a fancy word for bishop. It comes from the Greek word episkopos, which means overseer. Monarchical means you have one bishop in one city. and underneath him are all his priests, and underneath them are the deacons. This is the way the structure of the Catholic Church has had for thousands of years. And the question is, when did the monarchical episcopate appear? From Ignatius, it's very clear. He's writing as though this is the way it is. And he's writing at 110, and he's not writing like this is a newfangled idea that's been invented. It's been around a long time from Ignatius. And if that's the case, why then does not Clement talk about bishops?
Is it behind there?
I have a solution to this. So don't hang on. But the question is, when did the monarchical episcopate first appear? If you recall, in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles and the writings of Paul, the terms bishop, that is episcopus, and presbyter, that is priest, tend to be used interchangeably. They're used very loosely. From the New Testament, it's very clear that the exact definition of what is an overseer and is the overseer above the elders and what is the hierarchy there is pretty clear that has not been solidified. All right? And this should not surprise us because, among other things, one of the themes of this course I was talking about was the development of doctrine. John Henry Newman, the Blessed Cardinal Newman, wrote an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, and he talks about how doctrine, it's not surprising that doctrine develops slowly. He says, for instance, he talks about, for instance, it is true Saint Ignatius is silent in his epistles on the subject of the Pope's authority. Saint Ignatius does not mention Bishop of Rome or the Pope. Saint Ignatius directed his doctrine according to the need. When apostles were on the earth, there was no display, neither of bishop nor pope. Their power had no prominence as being exercised by apostles. So when Paul is writing his letters, and Peter and the apostles are all around the world, they're the authority, and there's no need to decide, well, Peter is in Antioch, who's second in charge? It's not necessary to decide that at that time, and whether an elder or an overseer is going to take the precedence. It's only after the apostles are gone that the issue arises, and only as dissension arises in the local church. It becomes important to find who the leader is. And the apostles have appointed presbyters and overseers and deacons, and those men are left behind, and it is necessary for a church organization to arise. And Cardinal Newman says, in the course of time, first the power of the bishop displayed itself, and then later the power of the pope. When the apostles were taken away, Christianity did not at once break into portions, yet separate localities might begin to be the scenes of internal dissensions. And a local arbiter, a local head person, in consequence would be wanted. Christians at home did not yet quarrel with Christians abroad. They quarreled at home amongst themselves. Saint Ignatius applied the fitting remedy. One bishop, one town, you got to gather around the bishop, and if you don't gather around the bishop, you don't even have the name of the church. So he's putting down dissensions in the local towns by saying this is the organization that we need, and it's implicit in what the apostles did by laying hands on people as their successors. Newman goes on to say, when the church then was thrown upon her own resources, the apostles are gone. First, local disturbances gave exercise to bishops. And next, ecumenical, that is international disturbances, gave exercise to popes. And whether communion with the Pope was necessary for Catholicity would not, and could not be debated until a suspension of that communion had actually occurred. You know, isn't it necessary to be in communion with the Bishop of Rome? Well, as long as everybody's in communion and everybody's happy, the issue doesn't have to be decided and explicitly declared. It's when some church somewhere says, no, we disagree with the Bishop of Rome, we're breaking communion with him. Then a crisis arises, and then the Bishop of Rome has to exercise the authority and make a declaration as to the authority. And Irenaeus is an early example of this, saying, well, there's all this dissension about what the true teaching is, and people are coming to Rome from all over teaching these strange things. What you need to do is find out the apostolic succession, and you can do it in all cities of the world, but the preeminent authority is in Rome because of Peter and Paul. So he traces it there. Newman then says, it is not a greater difficulty that St. Ignatius does not write to the Asian Greeks about popes than that St. Paul does not write to the Corinthians about bishops. St. Paul's letters don't talk about, well, you need to have the bishop do this or that and the other. He's an apostle. There's no necessity to decide that. And it is less a difficulty that the papal supremacy was not formally acknowledged in the 2nd century. And it wasn't formally acknowledged. We don't have a formal document saying the Bishop of Rome is preeminent and has authority over all the bishops. We have lots of indications of it, incipiently, the kernel of it, but we don't have an explicit declaration of it, perhaps until Irenaeus. It's less a difficulty that the papal supremacy was not formally acknowledged in the 2nd century than that there was no formal acknowledgement on the part of the Church of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity until the 4th century. The Holy Trinity got defined formally in the councils in the 4th century, the 300s, and God willing, we'll study that in the fall. But before that, where was the explicit definition of the Holy Trinity? It doesn't appear until the 300s. And we'll explore why that is and why the definition is really consistent with the tradition and not a break from tradition. But Newman closes by a very famous statement. He says, no doctrine is defined till it is violated. There's no necessity to issue a ruling unless there is a violation of the doctrine of the teaching or the church order. So it should not surprise us that it may have been a slower development about the monarchical episcopate. And it should not surprise us about Clement. What is still surprising, though, is that this is the consensus is it was written about 96 AD. And that's pretty late in the game. And it's really odd that Ignatius writes in 110, he's very clear that you have one bishop, one town. So that's an oddity. As a result of that, modern scholars of various stripes pretty much will say that from Clement you can tell that there wasn't a monarchical episcopate developed in Rome until late. J.N.D. Kelly, in his Oxford Dictionary of the Popes, he says, while Clement's position as a leading presbyter, priest, and spokesman of the Christian community in Rome is assured, his letter suggests that the monarchical episcopate had not yet emerged there, and therefore it is impossible to form any precise conception of his role in the church. More recently, a Catholic scholar, Eamon Duffy, he has a history of the popes called Saints and Sinners, and he writes a lot about this and pretty much concludes that the monarchical episcopate did not occur until fairly late in Rome. He says, to begin with, indeed, there was no pope, no bishop as such for the church in Rome. For the church in Rome was slow to develop the office of chief presbyter or bishop. He later admits, he says, the process of having bishops of Rome was certainly complete by the time of Nicetas in the mid-150s when Polycarp visited. So we have a Nicetas, if we recall, from the history, he appears in history when Polycarp visits him, and he's clearly the bishop of Rome. And so by 155, there's no question, by that time and even earlier, there had been a single pope. Soter also, there are documents about him being bishop of Rome. And of course, we have Irenaeus as well. But scholars like Duffy imply that that the notion of bishops of Rome came later, and that the succession was something that was constructed later because the early Roman Church did not really have a single leader. What it had is a council of bishops and presbyters who would act as a group, and that's why they argue that the letter of Clement was acting as a secretary, sort of. He's one of many writing this on behalf of the Church of Rome. J.N.D. Kelly, the scholar that we've been relying upon from the 19th century, comes to that conclusion as well, suggests that Clement is a kind of, he's a presbyter and perhaps a bishop, but he's writing as a secretary for a group of people who had been appointed by Peter and Paul, and not necessarily as a single monarchical bishop heading the college. And we really don't know, because the documents aren't full enough to know whether that thesis is correct or not, but you're going to run into it if you read it, and I just want to prepare you for it. However, the last time I taught this course, this thing was not available to me. It's very interesting. There is a man named Father Thomas Heron who wrote a PhD thesis in 1988 at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He wrote this thesis called Clement and the Early Church of Rome on the dating of Clement's first epistle to the Corinthians. And he has a very powerful argument that First Clement was really written before 70 AD, which is really dynamite for us patristic buffs, and now that you're all Apostolic Father people, this is really hot stuff. Now, it's a difficult book. It's a book written by a scholar for scholars. It's got untranslated Greek and Latin and French and German. So I don't recommend you rush out and buy it. But it's really powerful thing. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes saying what he says about this. But it's kind of interesting. Particularly if you're a nerd and into, patristics. It's very interesting. But it really does change the scholarship. The reason that most scholars thought, the consensus was that Clement was written in AD 96. And indeed, Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger wrote, we read his little discourse on Clement, and he accepts the normal dating of as being possibly right, AD 96, being late. By the way, Father Heron, after he got his PhD, he went to work at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for Joseph Ratzinger. He later was assigned, I think, parish duties in the United States. His scholarly career was cut short. He administered parishes. He died in 2004. But he left this fantastic thing behind. Here's the thing. The date of AD 96, the reason scholars have taken that, comes from two things. One is Eusebius, the church historian, writing in the 300s, said that Clement became Bishop of Rome late in the reign of the Emperor Domitian, which would be about 96. So he says Clement became Pope about that time. The other thing was that the Epistle of Clement, as we read, starts off saying, by reason of the sudden and repeated calamities and reverses which are befalling us. He starts off by a reference to some sudden and repeated calamities. And because they thought that he must have been Pope in the reign of Domitian, scholars thought this is a reference to persecution of the church by the Emperor Domitian. And that's what he's referring to. And that thing, combined with Eusebius, puts the date in 96. Well, a couple of things have happened. One is that as archaeologists and scholars dig into the records, they've come to question whether there actually was a persecution by Domitian of Christians. Domitian was a bloodthirsty guy, and he got assassinated in 96 because he was persecuting Roman senators and generals and things like that. But there is very little evidence that there even was a persecution by Domitian. The other thing that really turned the tide was the Epistle of Clement writes and exhorts the Corinthians to adhere to church order. And he talks about the temple worship in Rome. He describes the various kinds of temple worship, not in Rome, I'm sorry, in Jerusalem. He describes the types of sacrifices that are being offered at the temple in Jerusalem by the Jews. And there are certain different kinds. He describes them in detail, and he describes them in the present tense, as though they are continuing to go on as he writes the letter. Well, Domitian's older brother, the Emperor Titus, son of Vespasian, had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in August 70 AD. Not a stone left upon another. Totally destroyed it. And so, if Clement is writing as though the temple worship is still going on, it indicates an early date. Now, our friend J.B. Lightfoot had noticed this too, but said, well, he's using the historical present. He's writing as though it's the present, but it's obviously that he must know that it's been destroyed. And the reason Lightfoot assigns reasons for this, among other things, the fact that Eusebius says that Clement wasn't pope until Domitian. So how can he be writing this letter? Curiously, though, Lightfoot is among those who say that since Clement doesn't speak of his office as pope, he might be writing as a sort of corresponding secretary rather than as the pope. Remember that fact, because it becomes important. If the letter was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem in August of 70 AD, what other calamity, repeated calamities and verses, could this letter be referring to? Well, Father Heron has 11 different things that he takes from the text to argue why he thinks the thing was written before August of 70 AD. And one of the things he says is that in the year 69, in the Roman Empire, there were 4 emperors, year of the 4 emperors. Nero committed suicide in 68, and a succession of Roman generals claimed the emperorship. Galba, Otto, Vitellius, and ultimately Vespasian, the father of Titus and Domitian. And the first 3 all died violent deaths in the year 69. And it was a huge upheaval across the empire. And so Father Heron says what he's writing about is the repeated calamities and reverses are the reverses that were happening to the state in general in the horrible year of 69. And that the worship was still going on in the temple. And therefore Clement was written earlier than August of 70 AD. But what about the other evidence? That is, Eusebius says Clement wasn't pope. Father Heron says that can be answered by the fact that everybody seems to suggest that Clement was writing as a secretary, not as pope. And so Heron says it is very possible that in early 70 AD, Peter and Paul had just been martyred. The church was in turmoil, the world was in turmoil, and the church at Rome may or may not have had immediately elected a bishop. And Clement, being the learned man that he was, and the companion of Peter and Paul, may well have been a secretary authorized by the church, the group of the elders and the bishops left over, to write to Corinth. And therefore, and he was later elected pope. In other words, the epistle was written when he was the corresponding secretary in 70. And 26 years later, he's elected Bishop of Rome. If this is correct, if this thesis is correct, it solves lots of issues about the problem of monarchical episcopate. For one thing, Clement, in his epistle of Clement, is much closer, very close to the time of Peter and Paul, when they're writing apostles are in the earth, and the office of episcopus and presbyter, bishop and priest, are kind of blurred and not well defined. And so, instead of being written only 10 or 15 years before Ignatius's letter, which are very powerful about the need for a single bishop, it's written 40 years before that. And it's not at all unusual. So in any event, this thing got republished recently, and it's sort of becoming, in the narrow circle of people who follow this, it's becoming a very great thing, very exciting thing. Yes.
Does he address the writings of John or anybody else as far as the timetable?
This is a very narrow focus just on Clement. So no, he does not. And that's another issue. How, the tradition says that John lived to a very old age in Ephesus, and there's a lot of scholarship about that. Different issues though. But it's related, so that's the kind of historical issue that scholars are debating and looking at, and we get more learning when we see this. So anyway, this is actually being taught in at least some Catholic seminaries these days, which is a good thing. That Clement of Rome may have been written before 70 AD, which solves the problem that you will find if you go out and buy a off-the-shelf compendium of Catholic history in the early popes. You will read about, the monarchical episcopate developed late in Rome, and it's very odd. If this is correct, if Heron is correct, then the testimony of Irenaeus becomes even stronger. Because Irenaeus lived from 130 to 200. He writes as though there's a single bishop in Rome throughout this. He names them, as does Eusebius later. But Irenaeus is an early witness to this. Polycarp and Ignatius act as though it's very the normal thing is for there to be one bishop and one down. All of this witness says the monarchical episcopate was very early, just after the apostles departed the earth. And therefore they very strongly support the normal Catholic tradition. And the main problem about it is the difficulty caused by the late date of the Epistle of Clement. Let me finish up by going back. I don't want to finish by talking about this kind of sideshow, although I think it's important. Let me go back to Polycarp and J.B. Lightfoot. I gave you your handout like a week or two ago, and I didn't get to this part. On the back of it, I have an excerpt. This is the Polycarp. You may not have it with you. But on the very back of it is an excerpt from J.B. Lightfoot's essay, written in 1890 on Polycarp the Elder. And this is J.B. Lightfoot, a professor at Cambridge University, also the Anglican Bishop of Durham. And he writes about the importance of Polycarp and the Apostolic Fathers in general. And he says this: in Polycarp, one single link connected the earthly life of Christ with the close of the 2nd century, even though 5 or 6 generations had intervened. St. John, Polycarp, Irenaeus, right here. This was the succession which guaranteed the continuity of the evangelical record and of the apostolic teaching. The long life of St. John, followed by the long life of Polycarp, had secured this result. What the church was towards the close of the 2nd century was how full its teaching, how complete its canon, how adequate its organization, how wide its extension, we know well enough from Irenaeus' excellent writings. It's a fully developed Catholic Church, if you read the writings of Saint Irenaeus. There's no question about the Catholicity of this church that he writes about. Fully developed. Lightfoot continues. But if the position of Polycarp was important to the early church as a guarantee of continuity, it is not without its value to ourselves from the same point of view. Certain modern theories of early Christian history are built upon the hypothesis of an entire discontinuity, a complete dislocation in the spiritual and intellectual life of Christendom, so that the Church of Irenaeus was in the most vital points, whether of doctrine or practice, a distinct contrast to the Church of St. John. What this is saying, perhaps simplified, is that a lot of people, Protestants, atheists, dissident Catholics, will say, well, yes, Irenaeus has this whole system of bishops and apostolic succession and Catholic doctrine, but it was very different from the church taught by John and the apostles. This was invented later by power seekers in the church or in the government, and therefore the early church is much more like whatever church the writers advocate for. There's a discontinuity here. This is what Lightfoot, J.B. Lightfoot, says about this. To these shadowy reconstructions of the church, which overlook the broader facts of history and fasten on fragmentary notices and questionable interpretations, the position of Polycarp gives a direct denial. If Irenaeus is only fairly honest in his representations of his master, Polycarp, and there is no reason to question this, all such theories of discontinuity must fall to the ground. There might be growth, progress, development, but there could be no dislocation or reversal such as these theories postulate. And that is one of the themes of this course, and a particular theme of our section, First Section of the Apostolic Fathers, that there is not discontinuity between the doctrines of the Catholic Church and the teaching handed by Jesus Christ, bequeathed by Christ to the apostles, such as Peter and Paul and John. There's not a discontinuity. There's a continuity that you can see if you study these ancient documents that have come down to us. And therefore, with Cardinal Newman, we can conclude that to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. That's the end of the story of the Apostolic Fathers. God willing, we'll start back in the fall, and we'll go forward from there, and we'll talk about the development doctrine and these other themes going through a lot of heretics and the great councils of the church. Let's close it with prayer. In the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Thank you.